Without further ado, I'm very, very excited to welcome Alayne Blickle with us today. She is the creator and director for Horses for Clean Water, which is an award-winning, internationally acclaimed environmental educational program for horse owners. She is well known for her enthusiastic, down-to-earth approaches. And Alayne has been an educator and writer and photojournalist who has worked with both livestock and horse owners since 1990. Again, she is not in my neck of the woods. She's in Idaho, where she currently lives with her husband, Matt, who's raised and trained reining horses at their eco-sensitive horse motel and guest ranch, Sweet Pepper Ranch. But without further ado, please help me welcoming Alayne, and I'll toss it to you, Alayne.
Okay, thank you. And I will share my screen and hopefully everybody should be able to see that. And I want to say hello to everybody. And I see a lot of names and faces that I recognize, and I'm happy to see. Uh, I lived in Western Washington for 30 years, almost 30 years. Matt and I both did, before we moved over to southwestern Idaho, and we've been over here for 15 years. That's a lot of years to think about. But so most of my pictures, well, a lot of my pictures, not all of them, but a lot will be from Western Washington. And, a lot of my experiences is from over there. So what we're going to talk about tonight is pasture management. And I'm really happy to talk about this because I think I find that it's probably one of the hardest practices that we in conservation natural resources issues. When I say we, that's what I'm meaning, that it's one of the hardest ones, I think, for horse owners to get their minds around and um, to adapt to. So I'm glad to talk about it and to present some of my thoughts and ideas on how to think about it and approach it. So I'll start out with just a little bit of introduction to me and my background because it's different, I think, than what you usually see. So my undergraduate degree is in psychology and biology, and then a graduate degree in media production. But I've been working for more than 30 years now in the horse keeping and land management industry, starting with the King Conservation District in Western Washington. So I did that for years, and I worked on staff with them, and then I went to doing contract work with my business, Horses for Clean Water. So I am that horse crazy girl that many of you guys either are or can relate to, and have been a horse person since I was since as earliest years that I can remember. But I didn't have a horse. I took lessons for eons, and I rode other people's horses. And when I lived in Western Washington, that was when I first had my own horse on my own property, and it was quite the learning curve, but a very exciting one and a very exciting time. And that's how I met the Conservation District. They helped me with learning how to take care of my horse, and I was so excited about it. I wanted to be a part of the picture. Um, so Matt and I compete in ranch riding, and Matt worked for Boeing. He had a whole career in Boeing over there and over here as well, and then eventually took early retirement. And he does now what he always wanted to do or has wanted to do for years, and that's teach and train and show and judge horses. And I like to tell people a little bit about our place because I hope that maybe it might give people some ideas that might inspire them as well. Because our place here, we run as a business, but the business motto for it is that about land management and being environmentally sensitive. And that's the primary importance to us. to managing the place, and we hope that we attract customers and clients that with the same ideas. So we have a horse motel. Besides doing boarding and training, we also have a horse motel, and that's for people traveling with horses or for people going on vacation and need a place to keep their horses. We have a glamping tent for human travelers. And most of the time, what I find is these are people that want to have a horse experience, and that's why they choose to stay at Sweet Pepper Ranch. And Matt does lessons and clinics and retreats. And then there's my business, Horses for Clean Water. And so what it is about is I do classes and farm tours, workshops. I develop educational materials. I do individual consultations. And it's all about ways to take care of horses so that you're in concert with the natural resources. And the clean water part, I get a lot of questions about that, especially in times of drought. And people think that I bring water to horses to drink or something like that. But the clean water part refers to the problems that can come from a horse property that is muddy or overgrazed or has manure piles. And when you have these kinds of situations, you can have runoff of nutrients and sediments, bacteria, fecal coliform, as well as nitrogen from manure and urine. And these can affect water quality and cause a lot of environmental concerns that we'll go over, but it can also cause a lot of problems for us as horse owners. It can cause decreased chore efficiency, reduced productivity of our properties, increased vet bills. It reduces the aesthetics of our property and our neighborhood. So we'll be talking about that as we go along. And as I said, water quality. So the runoff from manure piles, mismanaged manure piles, from mud on properties, from sediment, from overgrazed pastures, or from using too much or incorrectly using fertilizers, that is going to end up someplace. And it can end up in our creeks or our ponds or our wetlands, or it can soak into the ground and affect our drinking water, which is a huge concern for many of us who have our own well on our property. So Horses for Clean Water is about win-win-win ways of keeping horses. That's going to be good for everybody, good for us, good for horse health, for chore efficiency, for productivity. It's hopefully going to save you money because you have more productive pastures and you don't have to buy as much hay, and it's going to conserve natural resources. So let's jump into our talk tonight, and I'm going to try to weave together my views of pasture management and why it's important and how it works, as well as the tools of the trade. And I'm going to talk about why healthy pastures are good for horse health as well. Okay, so I like to start out my talks with talking about the problems associated with not having that best management practice, and in this case, the pasture management. So I really think it helps us get a perspective on why these things are important all the way around. So some of the problems associated with not having a pasture management program, in this case, the pasture is way overgrazed. It's just basically like green fuzz, and you can see manure all over. And so whenever they irrigate or it rains, it's basically going to be like flushing a toilet, and all that manure and the topsoil as well is going to get washed off and cause a water quality problem someplace down the road. And too often our pastures end up looking like this, where they're hard and compacted and overgrazed. And a big problem that I see with this is what our neighbors think about that. And, you know, we might be more tolerant of things like mud and manure and flies and odors than our neighbors are. And yeah, sure, they're moving into our space. And, we may think it's not fair, but, we have to be a good neighbor and think about how we impact our neighborhood. And are we going to be an asset or are we going to be a detriment to our neighborhood? Another problem with not having a pasture management plan is weeds. So if you just throw your equines out on the pasture every day, they're going to eat what tastes best, and that's the grass. And they're going to graze it all the way down, and pretty soon the grass is going to die out, and all that you're going to be left with is weeds. And this is a real typical picture of what you often see in Western Washington in the springtime. And at first glance, it looks nice because it's really green. But if you look a little closer, you'll notice that the grass, there is none basically. It's just different kinds of yellow flowers. It's basically false dandelion and Shasta daisies, as well as a lot of other weeds. But it's not pasture anymore. It's just weeds. Another problem with not having a pasture management program is overgrazing and how it affects our horses as well as how it affects our grass plants. So in this picture, this is a severely overgrazed pasture. And I'm sure many of you guys have seen this in different situations. And what's likely happening is that horse is pulling the grass plants up by its roots and eating the roots and the soil particles along with it. And one of the horse health issues with that is that those soil particles can potentially build up in their intestines and cause sand colic, which is very common in the Pacific Northwest, unfortunately. And sand colic can be a lot of different things. It can be just basic unthriftiness, which is when a horse doesn't look good, is losing weight, maybe has intermittent diarrhea, all the way to impaction and colic or a twisted gut because the intestines are soft and pliable and the soil particles collect in a pocket or can collect in a pocket in the gut and can cause a twist or an impaction. And then another problem with overgrazing, and those of you who've heard my talk, you probably remember this part, it's candy bar pastures. So I teach in other parts of the country as well as other parts of the world, and I like to include pictures from everywhere, just if for no other reason than to reiterate the idea that these issues that are facing us in the Pacific Northwest are not just here, but they're universal. And this is a picture I took in Australia a few years back. You can see the eucalyptus trees in the background. And what this gal said is, yeah, my horse is overweight and I have him on the diet pasture. And the deal is that the most amount of sugar in a grass plant is in those bottom 3 inches. So when any of us think that we're putting our horse on a diet pasture by putting him on short grass, what we're actually doing is putting him in a candy bar pasture. So this chunky monkey is actually just eating all candy bars instead of eating bran muffins, which is what tall grass would be, more fiber and less sugar. We'll talk about that. We'll come back to that. And then climate change. I really, really, really like to include these thoughts in my presentations. I try to weave it into everything that I talk about and teach because it's so important these days. And we see the effects of climate change happening everywhere, and particularly right now on our East Coast. So, one of the ways that horse people can help with undoing the problems that we have associated with climate change is by having good pasture management. So in this picture here, it's another severely overgrazed pasture. And when you have an overgrazed pasture, you've got bare ground, you've got darker ground, soil that's exposed. And as we all know, dark colors attract more sunlight and thereby making the ground hotter, making it dry out faster, making it need more water to keep growing, and making it more compacted. But on the other hand, when you have a pasture like this is one that's creating climate resiliency. And it's actually helping to unravel the climate change issue. So we've got a good tall stand of pasture plants here. They are photosynthesizing and sequestering carbon and nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they're storing it in their roots. And climate change, one of the things about pastures and climate change that I always like to emphasize is that there's research that shows that grass plants are probably better at sequestering carbon than trees even. So, I mean, it probably doesn't really matter. We're not in a war between pastures and forests, but I want to emphasize how important it is to have plants photosynthesizing, holding on to that carbon and sequestering it, and keep shading that ground and keeping it cool and helping to retain moisture. And then through photosynthesizing, the plants are going to help with carbon sequestration. And I like to just throw this thought out there. This is my own thought. I don't have any facts to back it up other than my opinion. So this is a map from Bloomberg Media that talks about land use, and it groups it. It's not grouped by where it is. It's just grouped by all of the land use in the United States. When I saw this map, it just blew me away because look at that, how much land. It's the majority of the land in the United States is livestock. It's not horses per se, but it's livestock. So what if all of that land was grasslands like the one in the picture here? You just know that it's going to make a big difference for climate change. Don't you all think so? All right. So that's my little spiel for why pastures are important for climate change. So water quality is another reason why we want to have good pastures. This picture here was in Utah, actually, and this is an overgrazed pasture with a little pond in the foreground, but the pond drains out into a little creek and a bigger creek, and then it drains out into a reservoir. And actually, the reservoir is the drinking water supply for the city of Ogden. And in this picture, there's no grass. And the grass, if it was there, would help to filter out mud and manure and nutrients from manure and utilize it and not let those materials get into that little pond and pollute that water. And then, it goes into the reservoir for the drinking water for the city of Ogden. And of course, they treat it, but it just doesn't make sense to pee and poop in your water and then try to clean it and drink it. So that's why it's one of the reasons why it's important to have good pastures and good mud and manure management. And we want to take care of our water. All the water, the fresh water that we have is all the water that we have, and we're not getting any more, and we don't want to destroy what we've got. Okay, so let's talk about pastures and what a healthy pasture can provide, the upside. So, a healthy pasture can provide us with a natural exercise and mental health outlet for our horses. It can be a high quality, nutritious diet, food source for our horses. It can decrease our hay bills. It can provide a pleasing picture for you and your neighbors. It can help prevent soil erosion because those healthy roots that are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere are also holding soil in place. And then when they're doing that, they're going to filter out any nutrients or sediments or that might be running across the surface of your land. And then a healthy pasture is going to provide climate resiliency for the future. Okay, so let's talk about my tools of the trade for becoming a grass farmer and doing grazing management. We see this a lot if you do any research online about how to do grazing management with cattle and with sheep. And in essence, us horse people are just taking those ideas and adapting them to a way that would work for us as horse owners. Because we're different than cattle and sheep, and we cattle and horses have a lot different needs. They have different teeth. They may not want to be grouped together as tightly as cattle or sheep are. So we've got different different things to manage with horses and pasture management. So every good grass farmer knows about four things that we're going to talk about. They know about the crop, the harvester, they know about soil health, and the confinement area. So what's the crop that we're growing tonight, or talking about growing tonight? And that's grass. And the harvester, that's our horses. And soil health is obvious that we're going to be talking about dirt. And then the confinement area, that's the area that we keep our horses in when they're not on pasture. And we'll talk about each one of these things. So let's start with the crop. Sometimes some of these things seem obvious, but we kind of need to go through it and think about it a little bit. So I like to think of grass plants as little solar factories, and their leaves are like panels, solar panels, and they're taking in sunlight. And then once they take in the sunlight using chlorophyll in the grass plant, they are converting that to food for themselves, along with using nutrients and water that they get from their roots. And then they're going to take that food and they store it in the bottom 3 inches of their plant, as well as in their roots. Grass plants are also cool season plants. That means that they grow best in the spring and in the fall, and not as well in the summer when it's really hot. And let's see, what else do I want to tell you about grass plants? Yeah, so they store their food in their roots. So they should have a nice, long, healthy set of roots. But when you look at this picture on the right-hand side, how long do you think the roots are on that grass plant? So what's been happening in that picture where it's overgrazed is that the grass plant's basically been cashing checks that they don't have any reserves in their bank account for. So they don't have the solar panels anymore to manufacture food. So they're having to go to their reserves, their bank account basically, which is in their roots. And when they do that, then the roots are reabsorbed, they're slowly reabsorbed, and eventually you don't have any roots. And that's why we have seen horses like this pull the grass plant out by its roots. It's because it's been cashing checks that the bank account doesn't have any finances for. So if you look in this picture on the left-hand side, you can see this girl holding the drawing. The roots are like 2 feet long, and that's excellent. In the middle, they're maybe a foot long, and then the young man on the right, he's not so happy because his roots are pretty small because that grass plant's been overgrazed. I love showing this picture. Almost every picture that I have in this presentation is one I've taken, except for this one. And I've also had all those drawings made for me, so they all belong to me. But this one, it's from the NRCS. And this is a cool picture of what plant roots should be. And I hope you guys all can take this in and really be impressed, because that gentleman holding the grass plant there, he's probably like 6 feet tall, and those roots are taller than him. Now, this is probably a prairie grass that's never been disturbed. And what they're trying to do is show how an annual crop doesn't have much root structure compared to what a perennial plant does that is living its whole life without being disturbed. But that's what we want to aim towards. And the way we do it is by not overgrazing. So if you guys have questions as we go along, please put them in the chat box, and then we'll get to them at the end. But I hope you do have questions, and I look forward to answering them. So more things about managing about our crop and understanding our crop. So in the wintertime, our grass plants go dormant. And it's particularly a difficult concept for, I think, Western Washington, Western Oregon horse owners to grasp, because what color is our pastures in the wintertime? They're green, right? And being true horse people, we want to let our horses out on green grass. But what's going to happen if we do is that it's going to get all churned up, because grass plants in the winter are dormant. They're not growing. The growing season in winter is about 120 days. And so the grass plants are just hanging out. And the soil is going to be super saturated, as you can imagine from this picture. So it's going to be super, super soggy. And if we do let our horses out on the pasture at this time of year, it's just going to churn it up, and it's going to compact the soil. And that's what this picture, this drawing in the middle, is emphasizing. See, soil should be about 50% air, and that's what those little dots are in this picture. And when the horse steps on the soil and the soil is soggy, it's kind of like a sponge, and it's going to push all of the air out of that soil. And that's what you see happening here. So any kind of heavy equipment that you put on wet soil in the wintertime, or any time when the soil is super saturated, is going to contribute to compaction. All right, so that is number one. That was number one, our crop. Now let's talk about our harvester, which is our horse. And if we are here and together in person, I'd be asking you guys what you know about how our harvesters harvest the crop. And a couple of things that we know are horses are grazers. Their teeth are designed to clip grass, and they're super efficient at it. They can clip grass right down to the ground. And their teeth are just like nail clippers, the way they can clip the grass away. And we also know that they have a highly developed sense of taste. If you think about it, a horse's nose and tongue and sinus cavity is like a foot long. So it's so much longer than ours and so much more sophisticated. So they, among other things, what they really like is sugar. And where did we say the sugar is? It's in the bottom part of the grass, right? So if you have an area that's overgrazed, where are they going to want to eat? They're going to want to eat in that overgrazed part because that's where it's sweetest. Um, so nature designed our harvesters not to eat pasture grass like this. This is basically like a buffet, all you can eat buffet for a horse. Nature designed them to live out in the Oahe Mountains where I live in southwestern Idaho, in basically in the desert. And there you do have grass, but it's just like a bunch grass, and you have one bunch grass here. And then 50 feet over there, you have another bunch grass. And then maybe 100 yards the other direction, you have a little more bunch grass. And then when that's gone, they have to go way over by the creek and look for vegetation there. So that's how nature designed horses to eat. They didn't design, the horses weren't designed to be on this kind of a buffet. So we have to keep that in mind, and we have to keep in mind about the tall fibrous grasses, because that's what's going to be best for our horses. And I'll show you more about that as we go along. So soil health, this is kind of a new area that I've also tried to include in my talks, because it's one of those areas that we're learning so much about. In fact, I've had one of the people I'm going to quote in a minute from the NRCS, he told me I should quit talking about horses and just talk about soil health, because he said that's where it's at. So if we want to grow pastures, if we want to grow anything, we got to know about the soils. And there's a lot of ways we can think about that and learn more about soils. I have this picture here because it's from the Pacific Northwest, and you can see how little topsoil there is in the picture underneath the trees. And you can see that the rest of it is another kind of, subsurface soil that's not going to be as organic and not as easy to grow pastures on. So if you lose all of this topsoil, you're going to have a lot more trouble trying to grow pasture on soil that looks like this. So I'm going to talk about three things with soil health. I'm going to talk about soil surveys, soil testing, and some other ideas about improving the health of soils. So the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they're kind of like the federal side of conservation districts. They're part of the USDA, and they have a lot of information that can be of use to landowners in general, livestock owners, and specifically horse owners. So you can access that information for free and easily on the internet. All you have to do is Google Web Soil Survey, and it'll take you to the website. And then at the website, you just plug in your address, and then you can learn all sorts of cool stuff about your soil. You can learn about slope, how much slope your soil has, how much organic material it has. You can learn how much production you could expect to have. And all the soils in the United States have all been mapped out, and they're all the information is available here. And I might add that Matt and I used this information when we were shopping for horse property here in Idaho. Any property that we were interested in, we looked it up on the Web Soil Survey to see what their soil was like, because knew I wanted to have pastures, and I knew that I had to have the right kind of soil types in order to do that. So the next thing I want to mention for soil health is talking about soil testing. And your conservation district can help you with this. And your land grant university, I guess I used an old slide here, and this is from Oregon. It says Oregon State University, but it depends on what state you're in. But if you're in Washington, it'll be Washington State University. Um, but each state has a land grant university, and extension works through that land grant university, and they can often help with soil testing, or your NRCS office can help you. So you can look up those three things, either your local conservation district, your extension office, or your NRCS office, and they can help you with soil testing. And what that is you have a piece of equipment that's what's an auger in this picture here. And you just do a little soil sample in different parts of your property. You mix it up in a bucket, and then you just take a small plastic baggie of the soil and you send it to a lab for like 25 bucks. And then it tells you what your soil needs. It'll tell you if you need fertilizer and how much. It'll tell you how much compost or lime you need to add. And the thing to know about this is that I can't look at it. Any soil scientist can't look at your soil and tell you what you need. The only way you can tell how much fertilizer you need is with a soil test. And we really encourage that, because if you put on too much fertilizer, it's just going to run off and cause a water quality issue. So we really encourage you to know what kind of fertilizer and how much you need and how much compost you need, and then apply according to your soil test. Okay, and then let's just talk a little bit more about soil health. So here are some ideas, and the person at the bottom that I quoted is Marlon Winger. He's from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. He's a regional soil scientist in Colorado. And what he said is, if you're trying to make your soil healthier, you shouldn't see it very often. And that's something to try to think about. It kind of goes back to that bare soil thing that I was talking about with being a climate change problem. So if your soil is bare, you're you're causing a problem, and you're killing the soil, and you're lowering the health of the soil. So you want to do as much as possible to avoid ever seeing your soil. You want to have a good crop on your soil. So avoid rototilling. If you want to renovate your pasture, talk to your conservation district about no-till drills. If you're going to seed or renovate, limit your use of herbicides, because herbicides can kill the soil microbes. And then use compost as much as possible, because that's going to add back beneficial microbes of bacteria and fungal organisms. And it's going to help build a healthy biome, which is the animal and plant life in soil. So all I'm going to say on this slide is one thing, and I just think it's so amazing. There's more microbes, there's more life in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil than there are all the people on the planet. And that's just crazy to think about, if you ask me. And that's what you want to have a healthy pasture. So some of the indicators of soil health is go out and look at it on your own. That's called a field-based assessment. It's a real thing. Your soil should smell good. It should feel good. It should look good. Um, and it should smell earthy. It should feel soft, but it should still have soil structure. You should see insects in it and earthworms and little things moving around. You should see fungi, and that would be like the white filaments. Okay, that's it on soil health. So let's talk about our fourth part of pasture management, and that's the confinement area. So this is actually what I call the heart of your pasture management program. And we used to, in the old days, we called it a sacrifice area, but that word sounds kind of icky, and we've kind of all moved on, and we call it a confinement area. But horse owners also know it as a corral or a pen or a dry lot um, or a paddock. Any of those words are fine. But basically, it means that you're sacrificing this area, this small area, as grassy pasture for the sake of the rest of your pasture. And you recognize that grass is never going to grow in this area, but you're going to do your darndest to make sure that the grass in the other areas grow really well. And this confinement area becomes your horse's outdoor living quarters. It's where you're going to keep your horse in the wintertime when your soils are soggy and your plants are dormant. It's also going to be where you keep them so that the pastures don't get overgrazed in the summertime. And it's going to be where you keep them so they don't turn into a chunky monkey. So here's some examples of confinement areas. This is one of ours from Maple Valley from Western Washington. The confinement area is in a high, well-drained area. The pasture is below, which is great for biofiltration. Anything that would run off of your confinement area, because let's face it, the confinement area becomes compacted. So that means it's going to be impervious and you're going to have water runoff. And that runoff is going to go into the pasture, and then the pasture can use it. But what you don't want below your confinement area is like a pool or a road or some other impervious surface like that. This is one of our confinement areas now in Nampa in southwestern Idaho. And we have quite a variety of confinement areas, but these are our smaller ones just off of our barn. Here's another example of confinement areas. They can come in all shapes and sizes. But the point is to use a confinement area. You use them during the rainy season or whenever the soils are saturated, like during a storm event or when you're irrigating. You use it. Yeah, I don't think I meant to have that compaction slide there. Let's go on. You use it in the winter time when the pastures are dormant and not growing so that they don't turn into something like the top picture that was a grassy pasture, and they kept them on it all winter and it turned into mud and then weeds the next year. You use a confinement area in the spring and the summer so that your pastures don't get overgrazed and so that you can let them rest and regrow. And use them anytime to avoid this kind of overgrazing and to avoid ending up with an overweight individual. Okay, so we've got 4 components to grazing management, and they are the crop, the harvester, soil health, and the confinement area. So let's put them together. In the spring, we want to begin pasture time gradually because the horses haven't been on it all winter, so we got to give them their gut time to adjust. So we want to begin grazing gradually about an hour at a time. You can talk to your veterinarian, see what they recommend. If you have a horse with metabolic issues, you maybe want to start with 20 minutes. But what I suggest is an hour at a time, and over a period of weeks, you work up to several hours. And you put horses out on pasture when the grass is 6 to 8 inches long. You want it to be at least that tall. And then you remove them from a grazing area when it's been grazed down to 3 to 4 inches. Because at that point, you're down to the grass plant's reserves. And if the horse stays on it, it's going to start compromising the health of that grass plant. So here are some ideas of how to do the rotational grazing. Because if we put our horses out on a big pasture, they're going to go to where? They're going to go to where it tastes the best for them, which is the short stuff. And they're going to keep using those incisors and graze it down to nothing. So we want to treat them more like a harvester, more like a lawnmower, and put them through a rotational grazing system. And there's many different ways to do rotational grazing. I'm going to show you, I think I have three different ways to do it. But there's more. So, I mean, there's more options. You can come up with what works for you. So in the upper left-hand side, there's a barn, a confinement area, and then 3 pastures. And the idea is that you put your animals out in the first pasture each day, not for the whole day, not for 24/7. You put them out for a period of time, whatever your animals are used to. If it's an hour or 2 hours, I like to work up to 2 to 3 hours because I figure that's the equivalent of one meal. So they go out each day for their allotted amount of time of grazing, and then they go back in the confinement area. And then when pasture A is grazed down to 3 to 4 inches, you start using pasture B, and each day they go out on pasture B. And when that gets grazed down, then they go to pasture C. And when that gets grazed down, hopefully there's been enough time and pasture A has been able to rest and regrow. So this way you get greater utilization of your pasture. And here's another idea or another way you can set it up. This is usually called a wheel and spoke, because this is like the center of the wheel and these are the spokes. And this is the area where your horse's confinement area and where the food, the water, the salt is. And each day you open a gate, they go out here and graze, and then they come back in when their grazing time is done. And then when this one's grazed down to 3 to 4 inches, then you use this one, then this one, then this one, then that's hopefully enough time so number one has rested and regrown. And usually somebody asks me, like, what size should they be? And it just depends on the age, the breed, the temperament of your animals, as well as how much land you have. So these could each be a quarter of an acre, or they could be 1 acre, or they could be bigger than that if you have a lot of animals and you want to put them in each area. Here's another cool example. This one was also from Western Washington. This is in Hobart, actually. And she did I just thought she did had one of the best designs. So that's her barn. She had at different times 2 or 3 horses. And then she had like these are her paddocks. And they open into this central area. And then that area had 3 gates on it. And she had her pasture divided into thirds with permanent fencing, not with temporary fencing, but she did rotational grazing. So she would open up a gate and they'd go out and graze this area, and she'd do that. They never were on it 24/7. But over a period of time, when the majority of it was down to 3 to 4 inches, then she'd start with this one. And then when this was down to 3 to 4 inches, she'd go to this one. That's what her place looked like on the ground. So this is our place in Western Washington. And we do rotational grazing too, but what we do is we move a small pen that's temporary fencing and a solar charger, and we move it around on our 5 or 6 acre pasture. And we do that all summer. What we've gone to doing is grazing at nighttime. And that's because there's less sugar in the grass at night because there's no sun and the plants are not photosynthesizing. So there's less sugar. And also because it's not as hot because it gets really hot here. So we put 2 horses out at night and they have the equivalent of their dinner and their breakfast on pasture. We feed 3 times a day. And then we put 2 other horses out in the early morning or 3 other horses out in the early morning because there's less sugar in the mornings as well. And so it's the good time to utilize your pastures if you've got horses with metabolic issues. So in this picture, the upper picture is the paddock where they're grazing. And so we'd have the horses in there for 3 to 5 days until it's down to about 3 to 4 inches. And then we move on to the grass that's right next to it. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so we're putting it all together. So let's go over our rules for pasture management. And the first one is the golden rule of pasture management. And I didn't make this up. This is a rule that forage agronomists talk about. You never, ever want to graze below 3 to 4 inches. That bottom part of the grass plant belongs to the grass plant. So that means that I encourage you to get out a ruler or a yardstick and measure and get to know what 3 to 4 inches is, as well as what 6 to 9 inches is. Because you want to take the horses off when it's down to 3 to 4 inches, and you want to put them back on when it's 6 to 9. Another rule is don't allow your plants to go to seed. And that's because once a grass plant completely heads out and goes to seed, it figures its job is done for the summer, and it's going to kick back and put its feet up and go dormant for the summer. So if you can't get your harvesters to harvest fast enough, you might want to consider mowing it down to about 6 inches so that you stay ahead of it. And then winter pasture management, I just wanted to add a bit. It doesn't mean that you can't use your pastures in the wintertime, but the same rules apply. You don't want to graze below 3 to 4 inches. You don't want to have them out on grass or soil that's soggy or saturated. And then another thing you also want to be careful about is brown. A lot of times people think, oh, they can eat all the brown grass they want, but brown grass, and at this time of year when you start to get frost, your grass plants are stressed and they start accumulating more sugar, and it can put horses at risk for laminitis. So you want to be careful with brown grass and not assume that it has no nutrient value at all, because it still does. Okay, just a little bit about the tools for pasture management. Mowers are important to keep your grass plants from going to seed. And there's all different things that you can use. It's great if you have a tractor and a brush hog. But if you have a little bit of pasture, you could maybe just use a weed whacker. And in fact, we hardly ever use our pasture mower here on our bigger pasture. And we do use the weed whacker a lot because a lot of times it's just a small area that we need to catch before it completely goes to seed. But you can use other things like a riding lawnmower if it is more like a lawn tractor and the mower deck will go up higher, as well as the pull behind gas mowers. Harrows are important because you need to drag the manure that's in the pasture. I teach about manure management and composting, but that's for your confinement areas. And the manure that's in your pasture is fine as long as there's grass plants there to utilize it. You want to drag that manure and spread it out so your grass plants can utilize it. Basically, you want to harrow the rough. The rough is the area that the horses are defecating and urinating in. And you want to eliminate that and get rid of the rough. You want to spread that out so that you're spreading out all of those nutrients and not concentrating them in one area. And manure spreaders are also important to talk about. I really, really encourage people to spread compost on their pastures. There's so many important reasons why you want to spread compost, but it adds microbial life, it adds fungal organisms, it adds nutrients that are time released. So ground-driven manure spreaders, I mean, I think the bottom line is they're probably the best bet for doing things because you can pull them and just have a tractor to load, and you don't have to hook it on hook like the PTO power takeoff manure spreader on the bottom left-hand side. Every time we wanted to spread manure, you know, you have to hook up the tractor, which is hard to do. And then you spread one load and then you come back and you have to unhook it and then load it and then hook it. So it's very labor intensive, but you can pull a ground driven manure spreader with any kind of 4-wheel drive vehicle. And we have a 1999 Ford Explorer that we still keep just to pull our ground driven manure spreader. So compost guidelines apply compost to pastures, lawns, and gardens only during the growing season where you've got probably 3 more weeks. It depends on the year, but October is about the end of the line for spreading compost. And you want to spread it in a thin layer, about 1/4 inch at a time. If when you spread it, you get big clumps, you might want to go out and spread it out so that the microbes and the grass plants can utilize it. And you just don't want to spread more than 3 to 4 inches total per year in the same area. Hopefully that makes sense. And just a couple more slides, metabolic issues. I promised to talk about horse health, and the sugar in the grasses is a big part of that. So if you have horses with metabolic issues, like I had my horse Bob, who had laminitis. So what we would do with him is use a grazing muzzle, and that's kind of an old-fashioned one in this picture. There's so many cool ones now that have different kinds of bigger or smaller spaces that you can adjust in the bottom. They have cutaways for the nostrils so they can breathe, but they can still drink water with these. They stick it in and their muzzle in, and it fills up with water and they can drink. So grazing muzzles are a great idea, but try night grazing. You know, at this point, you might want to wait till next year because we're getting into that frost season, but it's crazy how much more they can eat at night and not get fat. And you really see it firsthand about how much sugar there is in grasses during the day. But otherwise, graze early in the morning until about 10 a.m. That's when our plants really kick in. Brown grasses, remember that they can still be high in sugar. Implementing a rotational grazing program is important with metabolic horses because it helps to avoid overgrazing on the short grass, and it keeps the horses eating the bran muffins, the tall fibrous grass plants. That's what you want them to eat if they're metabolic. You can also consider grazing on cloudy days or on shady pastures. Anytime the sun's not out or not hitting the grass plants, they're not photosynthesizing as much. Always remember for the rest of your hay to weigh it so you know how much you're feeding and you're not overfeeding. And then exercise your horses. Just like for us, they should get at least 30 minutes a day, at least 3 times a week. So that's it. And happy horse keeping. And let's see, I've got a few resources listed here. On my website, I've got a lot of materials. I also write for different equine publications, and I recommend these. Their materials are free and available to the public. My website, my tip sheets, I'm super proud of them, and you'll be getting some of them with this class. But I have about, I think it's 45 or so, and they're on other topics about horse keeping, like how to create an outdoor wash rack or build a round pen, odor control, feeders, how to build a permanent mounting block, pollinator hedgerows, lots of cool things. And I have a masterclass series which starts next month, and it's 6 weeks on all these different topics that I've got listed here as well as more. So I think that's it. And
Wonderful. Thank you so, so much. That was great.
sure.
There are, let's see, a handful of questions in the chat. This one is about renovating old pastures that were abandoned and overtaken by blackberries and tree seedlings. Do you have any thoughts on mulching services to renovate these pastures?
Yeah, Noah, you might have some thoughts, but what I would say first is maybe looking at other livestock to help graze it down, like llamas or sheep or goats would be really good to graze it down first. And they could do the mulching and getting rid of a lot of those berries. We actually have done that. It works quite well. Noah?
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. I would definitely recommend. I know a handful of cooperators in my neck of the woods use goats, and very similar to how they rotationally graze their horses with the electric fencing, the temporary fencing, they're able to kind of seclude those goats in a small area, and then they do all the hard work for you, and they'll eat everything. And then once that vegetation is removed, that is when you can go ahead and either do a no-till drill seeding and get some really great forage, grass forage in there to outcompete whatever might be left over. But similar recommendations. Let's see.
And do you guys have a no-till drill
We
that
do,
people can
yep.
rent?
Pierce
Good.
Conservation District does have a no. We have two no-till drills. So depending on how large your property is, what tractors that are needed to pull the no-till drill that you have available to you, you're able to rent it from us. The smaller one is picked up at our location, and then we have another one that's housed off-site. But feel free to go ahead and reach out to me if you're interested. But we have a handful, like Alayne noted, a handful of different equipment that's available to Cooperator Sabaro, including manure spreaders and the no-till drill and a handful of others that you can peek at our website. But on that note, I will also add my email and phone number into the chat just for folks to have it if they have lingering questions or questions specific about the district resources.
Good.
Let's see, best time to mow a pasture before spreading compost?
Yeah, after you're done grazing is a good time to mow, and it's just to even the playing field so you get the stuff that they didn't want to eat, and you kind of bring it down to a level where it's going to be more palatable. So that's the best time to mow, and then spread compost, and then harrow would be great. But you know what we're doing? I mean, that's the best case scenario. and I wish we did that for each grazing area, but we run out of time. I mean, you have to be realistic as to what's going to work for your system. We'll do all of that now. So any of the areas that we didn't harrow or didn't get compost spread on, we will be doing that this month. Yeah.
Wonderful. Next question we have, this might be dependent on the property, but how large or guidelines for how large the winter confinement area should be? Is there a minimum area needed per animal?
Yeah, so that's kind of like saying how long is a piece of string. It depends on the age, the breed, the temperament, um, for your horses as and how much land you've got left or available for that. Um, in the old days, I guess I used to think bigger was better, but the problem with that is then you've got more land to take care of because you have to pick up manure every day. You have to put footing in that. You have fencing to take care of and replace. Um, it's just all going to depend on how much you ride your horses too. If it needs to just be their dry lot, then it might need to be a lot bigger. Or you could do something that where you have smaller confinement areas, but you have an arena and maybe you use your arena as your turnout area during the middle of the day and it's a group turnout area.
Wonderful. Let's see. Jamie has good grass growth, but they tend to wait until the grass goes to seed before allowing their horses out to prevent laminitis. Is that a good idea, bad idea? Any thoughts on grazing seeded grass?
Um, yeah, I mean, you can also say what you think, Noah, but um, the it's what's going to work for you. I would say that you don't have to do that, and sometimes brown grass can have more sugar, so it just depends. I What I do is put them out when I know it's the most fibrous and the least amount of sugar, and that's how I do it. But I mean, if that system's been working for you and you still have good pasture, I would say go for it. How about you, Noah?
Absolutely. I think that's a great answer. And I think if it is working with your management style and you're maintaining those specific grass lengths that we like to see above the 3 inches and not grazing anything lower, and you're having great grass growth and not having any horse health issues, I think keep working on it. It's not a one shoe size fits all in this and in this scenario. There's great management practices, but if it's working for you, that also is probably a great
Yeah.
management practice as well. There was a comment on certain conservation districts not having equipment like no-till drill. I'll speak for Pierce Conservation District. If you reach out to us, we will prioritize folks that are in our county, but that doesn't mean that you're uneligible to borrow or rent our equipment either. And so if it is available, we're more than happy to allow you to borrow it, whether that is something you want to look into, but I know Pierce Conservation District has a lot of really, really good resources and not other conservation districts do. And so we try to cast that net as wide as we can. So look into your own conservation districts, but also reach out to perhaps neighboring ones if yours doesn't have exactly what you're looking for.
Good.
Let's see. We have a So we live next to a river. Do you have any sense of how far away at the river's edge our manure compost should be? This might be, I might put Emily Davis on the spot for this. She is the ecology. She works for the Department of Ecology in Washington State.
Great.
Let's see it. Emily, sorry to throw you on, but do you want to take a hold of that?
Hi, I was really hoping to fly under the radar, but Alayne, I've learned a lot from you in this presentation. So,
Oh, good.
uh,
I work for Department of Ecology, and our recommendation is it's going to depend on the size of that river, but I would say as far away as you can reasonably get it. And for large rivers, that's probably going to be at least 100 feet. I know that's not viable with the size of some folks' parcels and the layout, but I would say as far as you can reasonably get it. Now, for smaller streams, that could be a smaller distance, like 35 feet from a ditch or 60 to 80 feet on like more of a mid-sized stream. But I think that answer is going to be the annoying, it depends on your property. And then, of course, it's important to have that vegetative buffer between the river and your manure composting area. Grass is good, trees are better. So whatever you can handle on your property is great.
Thanks,
And
Elaine.
I'm happy to answer more questions about that too. I'll put my info in the chat for folks if you want to reach out after.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you
Emily.
basically, I would say you want to put your manure and compost piles away from property lines because you want to be a good neighbor and think about the high water mark for your creeks or ponds or wetlands and get it at least 25 feet away. More is better.
Yeah, all great answers. And when we're talking about building a really great location for that manure bin or the compost pile, it's always a great rule of thumb. It's a high and dry location and in an area on your property that works well for you, and the chores that you do. And so taking all these tidbits into account when you're deciding where to put that manure compost. And we do a lot of cost share, folks building these really, really great, elaborate compost bins to store their manure in. And you definitely don't need to go down that route. We have wonderful resources. If you want to touch base with me, I'm happy to send them to you of how just to build temporary compost bins out of pallets. And then maybe this year that location doesn't work great for you, or you decide to move it to a different area of your property. And so that's another, it depends answer. And there's a lot that goes into where you locate it, but high and dry away from surface waters is always a great spot to start. But with that, we're just at time. It seems like we ran through all the questions in the chat. My email is in there. Emily jotted down her email as well if you have some questions specific for her. And of course, Alayne has tossed their contact info up and has a website that you're able to contact them through. But Alayne, thank you so, so much for your time and giving this wonderful presentation. I know I learned quite a bit. And hopefully everybody online also learns something new that they can bring back to their properties. So, folks, thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your last day of September this year.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to say quick hi to Terry Church and Mary Kane, friends of mine who I see are on.
Wonderful.
And thank you, Noah, for having me. I'm very fond of conservation districts. And for you horse people who have great conservation districts like Pierce Conservation District and King and Snohomish that have a lot of resources, take advantage of them and utilize their expertise and the equipment that they've got available and develop a relationship with them because you want to keep those conservation districts there and working with horse owners and livestock owners. So
Wonderful.
that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thanks, Elaine. Bye bye.
Bye, Mary.